Hello, and welcome to the ThinkJSOU webinar series, brought to you by the Office for Strategic Engagements at the Joint Special Operations University. Today, we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSOU network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the United States government, the Department of Defense, the U.S. Special Operations Command, and the Joint Special Operations University. If you have questions after the session, please email thinkjsou@jsou.edu.
Hi, I'm Mike Lundstrom. I'm here with the Joint Special Operations University, and we are here interviewing Command Chief Master Sergeant retired Greg Smith, former USSOCOM senior enlisted leader, and the topic is strategic competition. Hey, Greg, how are you?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, so folks looking at various lessons are going to look at this podcast, if you will, or interview, and sort of apply it to strategic competition in various contexts. I think one of them will be Common Core. It might be find its way in other lessons. So what I want to talk about today and get you primed up for was strategic competition, and then kind of walk it into USSOCOM, and then a little bit of past, present, and then what's changing down the road. What do you see coming? So first question I want to ask is, the U.S. has been in competition with great powers throughout history. What makes this supposedly new era of strategic competition unique to the U.S. and, more importantly, DoD and the SOF enterprise?
Yeah, Mike, thanks for that question. And again, I think, from the lesson and other places, throughout SOCOM, we'll know that strategic competition is not new. Whether it's great power competition or integrated deterrence or strategic competition, any of these buzzwords that we're using today, it's really about a challenge to the international order. And, if you kind of look at it in a modern history lens, I know we've had a much deeper history discussion to this point, but a modern history lens really will take it about the surge in Iraq time forward, or really, kind of our war on terror forward. And in 2007, at the Munich Security Conference, President Vladimir Putin basically declared war on America below the threshold of armed conflict. But he basically said that the U.S. is operating in a unipolar world as a hegemony. And, it was a challenge to the other great powers that were out there. Right after that, he started what's called the New Look reforms of his military, using oil money and kind of a resurgence in Russian economy, and really rebuilt and overhauled the Russian military, which led to a series of challenges, direct challenges on U.S. interests, kind of in the near abroad. A couple of years later, in about 2013, President Xi Jinping, announced in Jakarta, Indonesia, and then up in Kazakhstan, he established the Belt and Road Initiative. And the Belt and Road Initiative for China, or One Belt, One Road, depending on who you are, really consisted of four key things. It consisted of Silk Road Economic Belt, or 6 economic trade corridors, the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, if you will, which is about 20 to 30 ports, parks, cities, or these industrial zones at ports around the world, everywhere from Cambodia, Sri Lanka, to Sudan, to Kenya, all the way up to Greece. And these were a direct challenge to United States interests in the economic sphere of the instruments of national power. At the same time, they established what I would call the digital Silk Road, where we see significant advances in space and cyber. We see things like Alibaba and Tencent challenging Amazon and other economic engines of American economy, if you will. And then finally, the Polar Silk Road, which was really a shipping lane moving all the way across through the northern passages around north of Russia into Rotterdam and the Netherlands and Germany. And these things directly challenged shipping, commerce, and the global economy. At the same point, Iran, if we look at 2015 to 2016, all the way up to 2020, the United States withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JICPOA, the nuclear agreement that we had, along with Iran's growing nuclear ambitions, its ballistic missile program, its use of proxies and UAVs and other pieces out there growing, and then the use of proxies to employ those. Couple that with North Korea's advances in space, as we've seen some successful attempts at satellite launches and ballistic missiles in their growing nuclear program. So these four primary challenges happening at the same point. The U.S. is in the middle of a surge in Afghanistan, a surge in Iraq, growing requirements for our counter violent extremist organizations. Put all that together, and you recognize that the environment around us was changing into a more of a strategic level global competition for influence.
That's a pretty good summation. Let's move it up a little bit to your time in the command. The DoD shift in primary focus to strategic competition or great power competition happened on your watch as the SOCOM's senior enlisted leader. What major changes did you see were necessary for USSOCOM to accommodate this new environment focus? How did SOCOM adjust, and was it sufficient?
It's a great question. And again, I'm grossly oversimplifying a lot of this, for purposes of this discussion. But, my boss at the time, General Rich Clark, had just come from the Joint Staff J5, the Director of Strategy and Plans, if you will. So he understood the intent of Secretary Mattis and General Dunford's guidance, then the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Carry that forward to Secretary Esper, then through a myriad of secretaries, kind of culminating today. So taking that understanding of the 2016 National Defense Strategy and a shaping national military strategy as overarching strategic guidance, we recognized in 2019, 2020 that SOCOM had to change. We had become incredibly purse tempo and depth tempo heavy in just one bid. Critically important, and that was the countering violent extremist organizations. Operations, activities, and investments across Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, right? We were still in Afghanistan at the time. All of these were occupying significant amount of our available forces. And through deployment after deployment, we had recognized that while we had honed our skills in that arena, we were less than adequately prepared to buy down risk or to work with the joint force in this new era of then great power competition. It then moved into the strategic competition phase and then the integrated deterrence. So at USSOCOM, we recognized the need to kind of overhaul, which was not without friction, but we recognized the need that we had to overhaul our deployment models, our distributed method of employment, very, very disaggregated forces, in order to kind of train together, deploy together, because we knew in this new environment, we would not have the freedom of maneuver that we enjoyed for the last 20 years. And when I say freedom of maneuver, that's not without contact or combat, but we enjoyed relative air and space superiority. We enjoyed relative sea power and sea superiority. We enjoyed freedom of access along our ground lines of communication and our ability to deploy and employ. Those things would all be challenged now in this new environment, which is not new. It's really a return to what was. So if you think of the 70s and 80s and the reason SOCOM was created, and that's what we did, is we went back to first principles, which is how do you operate in austere environments without the benefit of ISR, of close air support, of medevac and role 2, role 3 hospitals and clinics and all of those things. How do you operate from the sea if all of our SEALs had primarily been land-based for the last 15 years? So it was getting back to those basics of why each formation was created and then re-looking at ourselves to how would we best serve the joint force and the department going forward.
That's pretty amazing. This next question, you kind of answered a little bit in your last question. Let's kind of take it a little bit further. What do you think SOF's primary contributions to national security is in this environment?
Yeah, so if we think about strategic competition or integrated deterrence, all of again, these buzzwords that we hear a lot, they really just mean our ability to operate on behalf of the joint force. And SOF's value contribution, we really learned it during these last 20 years. And then again, during the Cold War, are really two things. It's those core activities that we can do which really the big five, if you will, which are, foreign internal defense, our counterterrorism pieces, sure, makes sense. Foreign internal defense in terms of the resiliency and the resistance of partner nation forces, should they be occupied by an obstructive or obtrusive or autocratic power. Right? When we think about counterinsurgency, it's really, are we supporting an insurgency or a counterinsurgency, right? So foreign internal defense, counterterrorism, we know. Really unconventional warfare. And what do we mean by that? We've heard terms like hybrid warfare and unorthodox warfare. Those are all terms for operating in a denied area by, with, and through. And when you think about it, by means, leveraging a host nation to get there, with them partnered with us, or through them, using them, as a pass through. So are we leveraging our partners in this situation? Are we working with them? Are we passing through them and using them as an access point, for lack of a better term? So unconventional warfare, gaining access to a denied area and shaping that appropriately. That, on behalf of the joint force, with allies and partners, in this new old era of strategic competition, if you will. And we've learned from the Peloponnesian Wars and all of these other things that what is old is new again, right? And what is new is old. So operating in a denied area, gaining access and characterizing that environment without the benefit of ISR, the way we've enjoyed it, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, without the benefit of all of those things that go with a large force. How do we prepare that environment? How do we maintain those relationships in these areas, either along the peripheral to create the multiple dilemmas for the adversary or the challenger, or to leverage those allies and partners in order to do an effect? And when I say effect, it can be non-kinetic or kinetic, right? So we are finish agnostic, meaning what is the desired effect that the joint force or the department or the nation is looking for? SOF's true value is working by, with, and through allies and partners on behalf of the joint force to achieve those effects.
That's a good answer. And I think if I wanted to add to it a little bit, it's what are we doing to get inside our competitor or adversary's headspace to give the perception that if you do something, it's going to impose a lot of cost to you, or it may not be.
Yeah, that's a great point, because, and you can take that all the way from the top, right? From deterrence, right? Don't do this. When you think about talking to your kids or a leader talking to the formation, right? If you're deterring negative behavior, if you will, it's usually through a series of pieces, and it can be from coercion to just simply detersion on both ends of the spectrum, if you will. Deter, don't do it. Coercion, if you do this, here's the consequences, if you will, or do this or else, or don't do this or else. So this rise of military information support operations, or MISO, becomes so critical,
Yes,
right?
yes.
We had the benefit of the United States Information Agency back in the, from the Cold War all the way through. We lost that ability to support American public diplomacy. So how do we, as the military instrument of national power, and then SOCOM as the proponent for military information support operations in support of this, how do we leverage, messaging, public support for public diplomacy, and if necessary, support for across the interagency for negative, non-kinetic consequences, if you will, should an action by an adversary take place? Couple that with all of the technological advances, whether it's in cyberspace, in space, virtual environments. How do you leverage all of this new environment, right? This new kind of interconnected, hyper interconnected environment of both the internet and space and cyber, and put all that together. How do you operate in that? Because that is a domain that we have not had to deal with in past eras of strategic competition. Couple that with forces on the ground? How do you misattribute? How do you provide cover and concealment? How do you allow that special operations force, be it from maritime with our naval special warfare, the littorals with our marine special operations, on the ground forward with our Army special operations, or austere air or penetration with our Air Force special operations? How do you put all of those pieces together? So kind of back to my previous question, which ties back to this question, it's really about getting the forces the time, or allowing the forces to have time to rethink the current environment and these core activities for new and ingenious ways to leverage all of this technology and yet still do our fundamental role, which is whether it's influence, whether it's educate, whether it's advise and assist, and potentially accompany. Is it by, with, and through? Is it just us? Is it allies and partners? Is it from the sea, from the air, from space, from cyber, all the way across all the domains? So this all domain warfare, or multi-domain operations for the Army, right? And joint all domain command and control with JADC2. How do we understand and characterize the environments? You need time to train to that. We need to be able to relook at our formations, understand, do we have the right tool sets to support the joint force going forward?
Well, that's great, because so you see the joint warfighting sort of working its way into those impacts, effects, and readiness, if you will, to further competition against a competitor or adversary. So that kind of brings me to this question, because you just ended on, how do we do all that? But it comes down to, how does SOF prioritize resources, training, and support in this environment? All that
And
stuff, right?
Yeah, this is an emotional question, right? It's an extremely emotional question for the formation, because there are pieces of the formation that have performed gallantly. I mean, just with honor and distinction, and solved the nation's problems, that we might not need as much of that going forward. Maybe we need more, but we have to look at each piece of the formation and understand, do we have the right things for this operational environment or operating environment going forward? So the joint warfighting concept, kind of codified now in the Joint Warfighting Doctrine Manual, that came out in 2023, August of 2023. When we look at this and we look at these things called globally integrated war games, we're learning things. We're learning things about structure, about what precise tools for the military instrument of national power, and then specifically, what is SOF's contribution to that? So through these war games and exercises and our operations activities and investments, we continue to learn and evolve. That's going to culminate in a pretty significant internal look that may result in significant structural changes to SOCOM. Now, what does that mean? Right? What do structural changes mean?
That means next question.
Yeah. Do I
ahead.
need? Well, let's break this down. For Air Force Special Operations Command, the last couple AFSOC commanders have asked this question pretty heavy. Do I have the aircraft and the special tactics teams that I need to solve to compete and win, right? Or to solve the nation's conflicts or questions, if you will, for this military instrument? And the answer's been sort of, right? So we've gone through a pretty significant, in Air Force Special Operations, overhaul of our aircraft inventory, of our crew complements, of our special tactics missions, put all of that together to support what we call agile combat employment, right? So how do I move forward in more austere environments where I don't have the value or the benefit of a big base, of big refits, and some of that? So how do we forward air refuel the joint force? We're seeing MC-130s on remote austere islands refueling F-35s, right? I mean, these are novel concepts to extend the reach of air power, if you will. We've seen, distributed munitions and advancements in small and medium diameter munitions into containerized palletized munitions in there. So you need the time to test, to fail a little bit, and then determine the structure. How do you do that on the Air Force side if you're still fully employed in our current mission sets? In the
Yeah.
Navy, for naval special warfare, right? We've spent so much time as another unit of action in a ground war, right? So our SEALs, much like our Green Berets, our Marine Raiders, and our Air Force Special Tactics teams have been deployed in Iraq, Syria, across Africa, in Afghanistan when we were there, Southeast Asia, doing ground advise and assist missions or direct action missions. How do I put the SEALs and SWCS back in the water? How do I partner with the big Navy for subsea and seabed warfare? What autonomous and other systems and tools are out there now that really force us to think, what does that complement look like? With the rise of the Virginia and Columbia class submarines, what does submarine warfare, our SEAL delivery vehicles, the advanced SEAL delivery system, all these different things, the dry combat submersible, as we call it, all of these things that are out there are changing the way we look at deployment and employment of naval special warfare forces. Overhauling our SWCS boats right now. We invested very heavy into SOC-R, Riverine, and those pieces. We had ribs, the 11-meter ribs or the longer kind of rugged, rigid hull inflatable boats. Now with the combatant craft assault, the combatant craft medium, and the combatant craft heavy, how do I leverage those technologies to extend the reach? The delivery and fielding of the unmanned underwater vehicles. How do I pair autonomy together? For our Marine Raiders, we've spent a time, again, like another unit of action, and that's not discounting that. But now, how do I think about littoral warfare? How do I think about strategic special reconnaissance, or SSR, as MARSOC refers to it? How do I enable the MEWS and the MEBs and the divisions, MARDIVs going forward, or the entire joint force? How do I work along those areas and really do those things that Marines excel at? For the Army, our Green Berets have an incredibly storied history. We have, in the last 20 years or so, really gone from an unconventional warfare mindset to a counterinsurgency and direct action focus. How do I get back to those basics and then leverage modular teams, right? So how do I embed a civil affairs team and a PSYOP team with a Green Beret team to create this hybrid entity that can really be a multifunctional multiplier, for the joint force in a denied or isolated area? How do I take space and cyber and integrate those things into this multifunctional team? So the operating concept 2040 for SOCOM calls for joint soft modular formations, right? So what does this hybrid team look like, leveraging all of these tools? How do we put all of those pieces together in order to do these things that we are discovering during the globally integrated war games? I've got to balance deployment tempo and our current commitments, because we will always respond to counterterrorism activities, if you will, or to terrorist threats. So our crisis response, counterterrorism, remain a key focus of the command. While integrated deterrence or strategic competition, we constantly prepare the environment and prepare our forces, what those might look like going forward. So a ton of work to do while still doing a ton of work on behalf of the nation really means a pretty big challenge, but nothing that SOF is not up to.
100%. And there's a lot to unpack there. It's beyond the scope of this interview, but you kind of touched on a few things when we talked about how the structure needs to change, because we're living off that past 20 years, right? So what did we get wrong in the last 20 years as an enterprise that needs to be fixed to ensure success in the new environment? Non-attribution, of course.
Yeah, it's always non-attribution. If you think about SOF's creation in 1987, and I know some of the formations were, created before that. But from SOCOM's perspective, SOCOM's creation in 1987, our primary focus at that time was really unconventional warfare and foreign internal defense, right? So those are two sides of a piece. Foreign internal defense, you're supporting a host nation, if you will, to free and protect its society, right, from insurgency, lawlessness, and violence. Unconventional warfare, you're disrupting a ruling power in a denied area to either coerce, disrupt, or overthrow it. Old definition, but those are the fundamental pieces of what SOF's value proposition. We're either destabilizing, an area, or we're stabilizing an area. It was one or the other, and then all of the activities supported on that. After 9/11, we really maximized our focus on advise and assist, and accompany, really with us doing it first, then teaching and developing partner and allied nations, and then doing it by, with, and through them. But our sole focus for much of this time really had transitioned into a single core activity, which was direct action, really nested under a counterinsurgency or counterterrorism, depending on how you looked at it. They were still direct action focused pieces. So we raised a force that only knows a kinetic finish, doesn't make it wrong, incredibly effective, incredibly. So now we're moving into a non-kinetic environment short of major theater war, large scale combat operations, or LISCO as the Army calls it. How do you prepare for the monotony of a non-kinetic environment when from the last 20 years, all we know is a kinetic environment? Those are great challenges on the force, for sergeant majors and chiefs and master chiefs and master guns who are out there on the training lines or at the battalion or squadron levels that are really understanding this, or the SEAL team levels, if you will. How do you reorient a force while maintaining those direct action skills? How do you reorient a force on this non-kinetic kind of shaping environment? It's a big challenge, and we have been over focused on the direct action, rightfully so.
Right.
But it's the teeter-totter shift that is not without kind of this weight of, no, we don't want to do that because this is what we know and this is what we're good. So how do I maintain this while understanding this, and then start to train for this? And what you'll see is over the next several years is a new breed of operators that come through the pipe that will only know a shaping environment. So what I don't want to be doing, Mike, is having this conversation in 15 years where we're not prepared for a kinetic engagement. So SOCOM, the component commanders, and the theater special operations commanders are constantly balancing kinetic, non-kinetic, direct action versus shaping, if you will, for lack of a better word. And the goal is to kind of keep that teeter-totter balanced in training and deployment preparation for each.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough challenge moving forward. And when I think about all the post 9/11 recruiting that's occurred, and the bulk of the force is most likely, I think, is post 9/11, right?
But there's a misnomer. So, and this is one thing I heard a lot, right? Is that, hey man, we need to get in the fight. You would be surprised at how few of our formation now have actually deployed kinetically. SOCOM, we have not been in a, don't get me wrong, we have kinetic engagements, but I mean large scale, enterprise wide, like we saw in Iraq, kind of 2004 to 2008, 9, 10. With a couple of surges in between there. And then Afghanistan really, in the beginning, and then 2010, to 2016, and then again, a little bit there at the end before the withdrawal. But the majority of our soft formation, and then, Somalia and these crisis response operations that we've done along the way. So we've had kinetic spurts, but really in the last decade, we have not engaged in a kinetic fight the way we did in the decade before. So sometimes as an enterprise, there's a misnomer that we're always kinetic.
Yeah.
My point to the previous question is we're always prepared for the kinetic and training for the kinetic. And that's not saying that's wrong. It's balancing that to the non-kinetic, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. It really kind of just ties it all together, just bringing it back to strategic competition, right? Because all the things we do, how we resource it, how we structure, how we think about it and innovate moving forward all matters to really, getting in the headspace of our adversary or competitor to be able to continue the international norms that the United States has enjoyed for so long. Hey, Greg, I want to thank you so much for coming on this interview to do this with me and for JSOU. Those are great answers and great perspective. And my hope is that, the audience that listens to this gets something out of it so that they can, tie it into their lesson content moving forward. So I'll give you, if you would, any last parting words, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, one of the things that I always try to do is kind of summarize all of this into very, very distinct quick talking points. And I'll say, kind of rehashing the questions that you asked, Mike, which were great questions. And a lot of this is off the cuff for me, so I apologize for some of the side ramblings. But if you think about strategic competition, think of it as kind of, Russia modernizing, overhauling, and kind of posing a direct challenge along the periphery. Russia is the acute threat. They have the ability to end the world's way of life in the nuclear environment, and they're unpredictable. So while they are not the pacing challenge, they're an acute threat. China, and I know I just talked about Belt and Road because it's an easy way, but China leverages all the instruments of national power, their instruments, to directly challenge the world order really established at the end of World War II. Right. And the United States national security strategy, the enduring national interest of international order kind of depends on everybody operating constructively in the global commons. So China's direct threat, economically primarily, but also in the information and growing military capabilities, significant. We didn't talk a lot about that, but their growing military capabilities underpinned by their economic competitive growth is a direct challenge. Iran, with their continued malfeasance across the global commons, and now their partnerships with Russia and China, supplying with North Korea, you're starting to see this direct challenge. In North Korea now in space and in the nuclear environment pose challenges. This summarizes strategic competition because it affects the rest of the world. SOF so heavily, along with the Joint Force, but so heavily invested in the counter-violent extremism and counterterrorism fights, rightfully so for the last 20 years, have lost some of our sharp edges when it comes to our ability to operate in the non-kinetic, strategic, competitive environment for the Joint Force. So in order to achieve these joint modular SOF formations, or joint SOF modular formations that the operating concept 2040 is talking about, we have to look at ourselves, overhaul a little bit of our training and our readiness planning in order to present forces to the Joint Force along with, by, and through our allies and partners to shape the environment to achieve the effects that the department and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff calls for. We always support our geographic combatant commanders and work by, with, and through our other fellow functional combatant commands to achieve these things. None of this is done in isolation. So SOF, space, cyber, seabed, subsea warfare, all of those things come together in this multi-domain operational environment. And SOF is looking, continuing, and evolving to compete and win in all of these environments.
Well, that's a great summary. Great summary. Command Chief Master Sergeant Greg Smith, thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks, man.